Time to slay this dragon, finish this section. You may think that you are not assisting a world historic, centrally important effort to all humanity by listening to this podcast. But what do you know? This is World Solution Writing Process, Episode 5, Part 5 of the Parallel Government section, and hopefully the final part of the Parallel Government section. You may think your time would be better spent doing quote-unquote concrete activism, getting to know people and building protests and movements and community institutions. Oh, you would think that, you sweet summer child, you naive baby, you. Little do you know that this podcast is how the world has a conversation with itself through me having a conversation with myself. Nanny Nunu. Alright, so this is World Solution Writing Process. Quick recap. This podcast is about me reading my draft of a book to myself. It's nowhere near arranged in the correct order yet, and that's the problem, and that's the point. I have to read it to myself to mentally process it so I can sort each chapter into its correct and completed form, because they're all written in a scrambled stream of consciousness, non-linear. So this is a bit of a non-linear ride that you're coming on with me, you, the listener. But I'm pretty eager. Got only 6 pages left for this final episode of the Parallel Government section, and then I'll move on to something else. And yes, there will be noise in the background. That's my heater. Can't do anything about it. Is what it is. Here we go. Diving into the notes. The best endorsement for a parallel government would be labor unions, but it would be foolish to expect this to be the starting demographic, because labor unions are membership organizations which cater to the short-term economic interests of their members at best, and are trapped inside the institutional conservatism of being bargaining units within capitalism. This prevents them from typically being involved in anything too radical unless the masses are already in the streets, and this explains the conflict between legal unions and insurgent workers' councils during the Italian Biennio Rosso in 1919 and 1920. That deserves a little more attention. There was a situation in which I think people really conflate labor unions and workers' councils. It doesn't help that there's a form of organization within a union called a works council, but none of these things are the same. A workers' council actually attempts to seize ownership and management of a workplace, whereas various other things just bargain for a better rate of exploitation, a less harmful rate of exploitation. So, okay. I can just read you parts of the Wikipedia page. This is in Italy, by the way. In Turin and Milan, factory councils, which the leading Italian Marxist theoretician Antonio Gramsci considered to be the Italian equivalent of Russia's Soviets, were formed, and many factory occupations took place under the leadership of revolutionary socialists and anarcho-syndicalists. The agitations also extended to the agricultural areas of the Padang Plain and were accompanied by peasant strikes, rural unrests, and armed conflicts between left-wing and right-wing militias. Interjecting, knowing this stuff is part of engaging with Bordiga, Amadeo Bordiga, and things like left communism, where they make criticisms that Leninism alone is not actually radical enough sometimes. Or sometimes Bordiga, it almost seems like more Leninist than Leninism, but the point is, in April 1920, continuing reading from the wiki of Biennio Rosso, in April 1920, Turin metalworkers, in particular at the Fiat plants, went on strike demanding recognition for their factory councils, a demand the PSI and CGL did not support. That would be like the moderate Socialist Party and the main labor union. The factory councils more and more saw themselves as the models for a new democratically controlled economy running industrial plants instead of purely as a bargaining tool with employers. The movement peaked in August and September 1920. Armed metal workers in Milan and Turin occupied their factories in response to a lockout by the employers. Factory occupations swept the industrial triangle of northwestern Italy. Some 400,000 metal workers and 100,000 others took part. On September 1920, 185 metalworking factories in Turin had been occupied. The PSI and CGL failed to see the revolutionary potential of the movement. Had it been maximized and expanded to the rest of Italy, a revolutionary transformation might have been possible. Most socialist leaders were pleased with the struggles in the north, but did little to capitalize on the impact of the occupations and uprisings. Without the support and quarantine, the movement for social change gradually waned. However, from what I heard, it was even worse than this. It was put to a vote that at some point the factory occupations decided to refer the question of whether they should constitute some kind of new system, they actually referred this vote to the mainstream labor union. And of course, the mainstream labor union voted no, like this isn't a revolution, we're just a bargaining unit. So this is why people get spicy against the idea that you can just form reform caucuses within labor unions and that we'll just have a smooth march from social democracy to an economic transformation. No. That's not how life works. That's not how anything works. That's not how workers' revolution works. That's not how economic transformation works. That's not how the relationship between labor and systemic change works. And the biennio rosso is a lot. Oh, and the English term is red biennium, or the 2 red years. Biennio or biennium is just a 2-year period. Sorry I didn't clarify that up front. And now I've deviated far from my notes in explaining all this to you mere mortals. I will continue in my notes. The Congress of Angostura was a revolutionary government in Latin America during Latin American independence in the early 1800s. All right, when you punch the phrase parallel government into iask.ai, it defines parallel government thus. A parallel government refers to a situation where an alternative governing body operates alongside the officially recognized government of a country. This parallel government may claim legitimacy and authority, often challenging or seeking to replace the existing government. The concept of a parallel government can arise in various contexts, such as during times of political unrest, armed conflicts, or when there is a dispute over the legitimacy of the ruling regime. Notably, it provides the examples of the workers' councils in Russia 1917 and the French government in exile during World War II. It goes on to explain various activities of a parallel government. One is claiming legitimacy. Parallel governments assert their legitimacy by challenging the authority of the existing government. They often present themselves as the true representatives of the people and claim to uphold democratic principles or other ideological frameworks. Policy formulation and implementation. Parallel governments develop their own policies and implement them within areas they control or seek to govern. This includes making decisions on issues such as security, public services, economic management, and social welfare. An aside, which I clarify, getting away from the IS.ai definition of parallel government. While in the civil model of parallel government, in which a parallel government contends for power through protest, as opposed to the guerrilla warfare model, there are unlikely to be any areas under the parallel government's control until the old government falls. But the task of policy formulation nonetheless remains critical for indicating what promises the parallel government is making to the people, and thus articulating the reasons why the people should support the parallel government. So other activities which iask.ai specified that parallel governments engage in. Opposition activities. Parallel governments engage in opposition activities against the ruling regime, such as organizing protests, strikes, or armed resistance. They aim to undermine the authority of the existing government and gain popular support for their cause. One more item IAS.ai claims is, quote, international recognition. Parallel governments may seek recognition from other countries or international organizations to enhance their legitimacy and gain support. Recognition can provide access to diplomatic channels, financial aid, and military assistance. For a socialist parallel government, it is at first unlikely that any foreign government would issue statements recognizing your legitimacy, but groups in your country, or other countries might, so international recognition would be more about organizations than governments. The Continental Congress, which founded the United States, was a parallel government contending for power by a guerrilla warfare strategy. The modern United States is no longer a good arena for such a strategy, being too developed. Instead, a modern American revolution would be more like the original French and Russian revolutions, which were based on crowd rebellions in major cities, similar to the modern Arab Spring and color revolutions. The United States has already seen its share of multiple crowd rebellions in recent times, from Occupy to Antifa to George Floyd. So the point is to organize the next crowd rebellion around demanding a change of government rather than demanding reforms, which is accompanied by forming the parallel government and beginning small street actions in its name. Ooh, okay. Lenin using the word parallel government to describe the 1917 workers' councils. Let me check what the source of this is before I start spewing and reading it. Lenin, Letters on Tactics. That's nice. Okay, so indeed, reality shows us both the passing of power into the hands of the bourgeoisie, parenthesis, a completed bourgeois democratic revolution of the usual type, end parentheses. As an aside, it seems he's talking about the February Revolution. And side by side with the real government, the existence of a parallel government This is Lenin saying the word parallel government, blowing my mind, which represents the, quote, revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, end quote. This second government has itself ceded power to the bourgeoisie, has chained itself to the bourgeois government. So if you know anything about the February Revolution in Russia 1917, basically, at one level, it was just a democracy revolution against the monarchy, and it had a typical capitalist government come and replace the monarchist government. But the struggle to overthrow the monarchy required not just popular protest, though there was a lot of that. It required labor action. It required workers occupying their workplaces. And at first, the workers didn't think of this as, oh, we can take over our workplaces and start a new economic system. They just saw it as part of the struggle against the monarchy. So after February, you had this dual power situation in which there was a Russian provisional government, which was capitalist. And side by side with it, you had a federation of workers' councils or workplaces that had undergone these mutinies and were sending delegates to a central federation. And these two governments existed side by side. And Lenin's just sort of summarizing this for us. Oh, and in the same article, he uses the phrase parallel government twice. But there's another instance that I think is completely different. Yeah, the tasks of the proletariat in our revolution, written sometime in 1917. Let me parallel. Okay, yeah. Oh man, Lenin. The main feature of our revolution, a feature that most imperatively demands thoughtful consideration, is the dual power which arose in the very first days after the triumph of the revolution. This dual power is evident in the existence of two governments. One is the main, the real, the actual government of the bourgeoisie, the provisional government of Lvov and company, which holds in its hands all the organs of power. The other is a supplementary and parallel government, a controlling government in the shape of the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies, which holds no organs of state power, but directly rests upon the support of an obvious and indisputable majority of the people, on the armed workers and soldiers. I think it's really striking that I went down this whole rabbit hole of studying liberal nonviolent democracy revolutions as articulated by the arch theorist of them, Dr. Gene Sharp. And he has 198 tactics of nonviolent struggle that he lists. And the last tactic, number 198, says dual sovereignty or parallel government. So I began investigating this term, parallel government. And the more I dig deep, I go back and read Gene Sharp's older writings. And he's referring to Crane Brinton. Or at least he's referring to some of the same references that Crane Brinton uses. And I know I've said this before in a prior episode, Crane Brinton being an American historian of the French Revolution. And I dig deeper into where Crane Brinton is getting it from, and he says Russian theorists or Russian revolutionaries. Lo and behold, dual power is really what they were chasing after, what Crane Brinton was really describing. And the theorist of that was Lenin, and the only other commentator from the Russian Revolution on that, in the main, was Trotsky. Though I have been meaning to look up Stalin on dual power. I'm not sure Stalin had so much to say about it. He was just kind of a party man building, demonstrations for socialism, rather than having a concept of forming a government. But I'm sure he supported whatever Lenin was saying because he was an intelligent, politic opportunist who would do whatever he had to do to secure his position. But anyway, I'm not here to bemoan Stalin. That's been done. Back to my notes. There could be urban parallel governments in places like New York City, Minneapolis, Atlanta in the United States, or St. Petersburg in Russia. Okay. I'm reading from the wiki on the National Council of Resistance of Iran. It was founded by Masoud Rajavi and Abul Hassan Banisadr in 1981. Both co-signed a covenant outlining Banisadr as the Republic's president and of Rajavi as the chairman both of the National Council and of the Republic's provisional government. So now I'm reading from an article about the NCRI. The NCRI sought political and financial support from Western governments and individuals opposed to the IRI, I believe that's the Islamic Republic of Iran, and attempted to present itself as the alternative government to the IRI, mimicking the approach of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The NCRI styled itself as the parliament in exile of the Iranian resistance, with Rajavi as the president-elect, fighting for the establishment of a democratic Islamic Republic in Iran. Unfortunately, the MEK and NCRI, MEK is movement organization they're affiliated with, have devolved into cult organizations with extreme mistreatment of their own membership, making it unsupportable at this point. But earlier, it was an interesting case study of an Islamic democratic socialist parallel government for Iran. I mean, you can see why I think this is something worth mentioning, even if I hesitate about them now. Okay, more notes. Once your parallel government hits 8 or 9 people, you should probably elect a leader or accept the self-appointment of anyone audacious enough to do such a thing. And if you get bigger than that, you'll need a central committee. Parallel governments below 10 people don't need an executive branch. Beyond that, they will not be able to function without one. And this comes from recommendations made in the book Swarmwise, which is about how to build movements. This guy, I think in Iceland, built the Pirate Party in favor of internet downloading. From nobody to, I think, a very large number of people. It's still a minor party in that country, but he basically made this argument that humans naturally group into certain numbers, and once you get bigger than a certain number, it gets unwieldy and people don't feel connected with each other. You actually have to keep it kind of a small and intimate group and then create a hierarchical federation of those groups. So once you hit 8 or 9 people, you actually need a leadership hierarchy, but below that, you don't need one. So leadership selection in a parallel government should be based on 2 criteria. A person's skills at organizing a parallel government, and the ideological or political orientation preferred by the group. Demographic diversity can be a competing priority against these 2 centrally unavoidable principles. So you may have people who know parallel government theory. You do have to actually worry about not just an affirmative action style inclusivity. You actually do have to choose for, does someone really understand parallel government? And do they really hold to the ideology we are advocating? More notes. It's technically possible that parallel government might be considered a form of sedition, but since forming a parallel government is typically a totally nonviolent and civilian task, it is unlikely to attract negative attention from law enforcement in its early stages. Typically, it might be protected by First Amendment rights of free speech and free assembly, since the parallel government is literally just a series of meetings where people talk and vote on resolutions. The danger arises when a parallel government starts organizing street actions, but that also depends what type of street actions. If they avoid violence, or the civil disobedience of blocking car traffic or building entrances, focusing instead on marches, rallies, or comedic happenings, law enforcement is unlikely to care. Also, it is critical to remember that the modern political system of every major powerful nation on earth was founded by revolution, and virtually all revolution can be defined as sedition, since sedition means a rebellion which aims to remove the current lawful government. The paradox of modern states is they disallow the very act which created them in the first place. Our future democratic socialist government will have to do the same exact thing to ensure stability, but against the capitalist governments, and this is a contradiction we can utilize. Also, finally, in the United States, sedition is defined as a violent activity. So, peacefully forming a parallel government does not fit the technical legal definition of sedition in the United States, whereas January 6th might fit. More notes. To be clear, parallel governments hold no real power in the beginning other than the power to give their own members an elevated motivation for organizing. The ignorant would then claim that a parallel government is not a real government, whereas instead it functions as an ongoing institutional protest while contending to become the ruling government. It is a rallying point around which the people can gather in revolt. More notes. Rather than anarchist anti-system, we cannot effectively fight the system without creating a system of our own, like the resistance in Sarah Connor Chronicles utilizing its own Skynet splinter to fight Skynet. More notes. If a parallel government could be built out of electoral parties, in the USA it might make sense to have a green-yellow alliance of Greens and Libertarians, possibly later stabilizing the situation by including any renegade factions of the Democrats who get on board with socialism after being confronted by a revolution. That, I guess, would be a green-blue alliance. Bordiga was correct in seize power or seize the factory, but it was missing a few pieces. It doesn't matter if you besiege, take over, or wreck all the police stations. If you don't form a grassroots revolutionary government, with a grassroots revolutionary government, you may even be able to skip much of the conflict with the police. I highly recommend everyone read. It's a free article on the internet. Amadeo Bordiga, Seize Power or Seize the Factory. And while you're at it, Amadeo Bordiga on activism. Get back to the notes. Okay, it's easy to get the ball rolling of a parallel government by simulating a parallel government as a simple role-playing game. Here are the rules. Take turns going in a circle. On your turn, you propose a piece of legislation that will become a position of the parallel government, which it promises to enact when it comes to power. It can be silly, serious, or both. On each turn, the legislation is deliberated or discussed and voted on by the whole group. A volunteer or elected parliamentarian may limit length of deliberation using a timer or hourglass and can moderate discussion as needed. Between each round, not between each turn, but between each round, can go out anywhere the people gather, or just film yourselves, declaring all the legislation you passed as demands presented to the people. And the legislation that you write or the videos that you create can be posted to social media as you wish. So it's like a kind of like an alternate reality game or a live action role playing game. But I mean, it's hard to separate anything you do in life from being a live action role playing game. It's like you're LARPing when you like fold your laundry. You're LARPing as someone who folds your laundry. Can't avoid it. And you may think you're not, but you may be part of a bigger game of which you are unaware. Ooh la la. More notes. Since all capitalist governments and many other governments are illegitimate, a parallel government on the basis of grassroots self-appointment is legitimate, despite any initial skepticism otherwise. Partially because such a government is provisional and transitional rather than permanent, and partially because the humanitarian and ecological crises of late capitalism give legitimacy to any opposition government against a capitalist government, even one that otherwise might seem highly irregular. All revolutionary governments are highly irregular in the beginning, after all. Revolutionary government always starts out as DIY punk nonsense. We must remember that establishment legitimacy and populist revolutionary legitimacy are virtual opposites, with establishment legitimacy being based on an institution having a long prior existence, and revolutionary populist legitimacy being based whether it expresses popular grievances which are not well represented by the so-called proper channels. Outsider status of being a nobody is a basis of legitimacy rather than illegitimacy for revolutionary and popular institutions, as well as the raw necessity of such an institution, as indicated not primarily by popular desire or support, but by objective material conditions of crisis and suffering. More notes. There was the Nassau Pirate Republic. Before the American Revolution in the Bahamas, in Nassau there was a pirate republic where the pirates actually established a little government and had a little democracy in Caribbean. And it was before the American Revolution. It's on Wikipedia, the Republic of Pirates. And it was from 1706 to 1718. That's cool. What else do we got? You may think a grassroots parallel government might not have legitimacy, but the approval rating of U.S. Congress historically hovers in the 10 to 20% range. Let's see what it is now. Right now, Congress's approval rating is 13%. I mean, there should just be a rule that if your legislature's approval rating falls below 25%, it just gets immediately overthrown by ninjas. That should be the rule. Anyway, failed attempts are not wastes of energy, but prepare the way for future successful attempts. I can already hear reformist pragmatists and realists objecting that a parallel government is a nice idea, but they couldn't imagine what circumstances would get us to the point where one would be a truly viable option instead of an ineffective and possibly ridiculous spectacle. Of course, they could just look out a window at the nightmarish state of the world or turn on the news, but let's assume they're too invested in a public image of being the reasonable ones who avoid getting involved in anything that sounds too weird or new or radical, since that's a pretty common mindset among reformists. The answer is that successful, stable, quote, legitimate parallel governments will only emerge after initial attempts at organizing parallel governments which turn out to be ineffective and possibly ridiculous spectacles, combined with other conditions such as protests, strikes, civil disobedience, riots, mass social dysfunction, and mass suffering, all of which have already occurred, at least in the United States, Britain, and France, recently. Either one of the irregular parallel governments will morph into something more successful, or unsuccessful parallel governments will be followed by separate successful ones. How dare you unimaginative crybabies force me to spell it out so thoroughly? Seriously, you narrow-brained normies, put me through my paces. Oh, the mental conservatism of social democracy. Oh, the mental conservatism of those who believe they're already enlightened. More notes. It is the responsibility of democracy activists and organizers, socialist organizers, to study political governmental dual power throughout history and the present in all its many variations, including legislatures like those of the Enlightenment and people's parties like the Indian National Congress and African National Congress. Emphasis I am placing on the word Congress in the names of both of those opposition parties. Isn't it interesting that they refer to themselves as Congresses, meaning that a concept of parallel government was always implicit in their existence during their entire liberation struggle. we must not dogmatically restrict ourselves to workers' councils alone, as Marxists often do, and not fall into the anarchist error of prioritizing non-governmental dual powers such as mutual aid or cooperatives, which tend to be an end in themselves, having limited impact on the revolutionary process, and which never have the resources to substitute for state institutions. More notes. Establishing governing structures such as legislature and executive, plus administrative departments such as welfare, economic planning, and security. Okay, so if you're forming a parallel government in a country, and your country has a Department of Labor, a Department of State, you're going to want people in your little executive administration that you form to specialize in those areas, specific people to specialize in those areas, so we are literally prepared to step into power. We're not forming our own Department of State. We're not forming our own Department of Labor. We are providing an administration to take them over, even if doing so by non-electoral means. More notes. A parallel government can seek support from organizations in neighboring countries, as well as places with common political or ethnic heritage, such as Europe for the majority European American USA. European American being like, an extremely polite word for white person. So while parallel governments for simple capitalist democracy seek international recognition from foreign governments, a socialist parallel government would be better off seeking international recognition from socialist organizations rather than governments. Okay, I did say that earlier. The Republic of Pirates. This republic extended the direct democracy of pirate ships, which did exist, oddly enough, if you didn't know that, to a representative democracy on land, with an elected magistrate, and the place acting for a free haven for piracy, where all were considered equal citizens. They followed a literal pirate code, which guaranteed equality to all pirates and democracy on ships. So it wasn't just that individual pirate ships were practicing democracy. Any pirate ship operating out of the Republic of Pirates also had to be practicing democracy on its ship, with captains being elected and many decisions made by vote on the ships. Well, you may not believe it, but we got through it. That is all I've got for now on parallel government, though it is referred to throughout the rest of this book in progress that I'm working on writing. It wasn't too long. This is the last episode on parallel government for now, hopefully for a long time. And sorry if that was painful for you to get through all of that, but now we can do other topics. Now we can just fly off into the strategy of how a parallel government would actually install itself using a sort of crowd revolution. How do you get the military to flip sides from supporting the ruling government to aligning with your upstart government? Fortunately, many color revolutions, many crowd revolutions, and yes, even the Russian Revolution and French Revolution involved this precise occurrence. And we will dig into that way deep in future episodes on a new topic. But thank you for bearing with me this far. Thank you for getting through these 5 episodes on parallel government specifically, despite the fact that they may have been repetitive or nonlinear, wandering, meandering. You may be feeling like you're missing context of how do you take this thing that you just created yourself out of yourself or a group of people you know and turn it from a role-playing game into a social movement. And that is going to be the topic of future episodes. That was not a topic of the last 5 episodes. Coming up, I also have just sort of an interlude about how life kind of is a role-playing game. And we live in very interesting times. We live in revolutionary times, and sometimes you may be sad because things are very hard, and they very much are very hard right now. But the good news is, at another level, at a deeper level, this is the greatest time in your life, because you are living in the era of the transformation of society. You are living in the crises that make the way for society to change. And if you feel betrayed by life, as would be completely reasonable to feel, honestly, at this point, I would just say, keep in mind the other side of it, that an interesting life does involve struggle. A stimulating life and fulfilling life does involve struggle. And right now, you are in the struggles of your life. And the conflicts and hardships you're going through right now are the main plot of your existence. Don't think of them as they're imposed on you externally, but don't think of them as not part of your life plan. Think of them as the subject matter of your life, the central plot of your life. These things that you didn't want to deal with, these things that you didn't see coming, these hardships that you didn't expect, these challenges and solutions you're having to find on a sort of impromptu ad hoc DIY basis. Yeah, but I'll get into that more in the next episode, which will be an interlude between this section on parallel government and the next section on some other more highly political topic. the next interlude is going to be a little personal, but I think you'll get something out of it. Give it a try. And thank you for listening so far. This was World Solution Writing Process Podcast, Episode 5, and Part 5 and final part of the Parallel Government section. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.